A sudden downpour was the last thing I expected. I had stepped out of the design studio, exhausted from a long day of revisions and last-minute client demands, only to be greeted by sheets of rain pounding against the pavement. The city, usually alive with hurried footsteps and honking cars, had momentarily paused as people took shelter under awnings and bus stops. And I, like the fool I was, had forgotten my umbrella. Great, I muttered under my breath, adjusting the strap of my messenger bag. There was no taxi in sight, and the nearest subway station was a 10-minute walk away. I considered making a dash for it, but just as I took a hesitant step forward, a deep voice stopped me.
"You'll catch a cold."
I turned to the source of the voice. A man stood beside me, his tall frame partially obscured by the dim streetlights. His black trench coat, neatly tailored to his broad shoulders, barely had a drop of rain on it, as if the storm itself knew better than to touch him. He held an umbrella, sleek and simple, positioned just enough to shield himself from the rain. His sharp, well-defined features were unreadable, but there was a quiet authority in his presence. I frowned slightly. I don't exactly have a choice. For a second, he seemed to contemplate something. Then, without another word, he extended his umbrella toward me.
"Take it."
I blinked, caught off guard. "What?"
"I have a car waiting."
His tone was calm, matter-of-fact, as if this small act of kindness was nothing worth mentioning.
"You need it more than I do."
I hesitated. Who just gave away their umbrella to a stranger? But the cold wind made my decision for me. I accepted the handle, my fingers brushing against his gloved hand for the briefest moment. "Thanks," I said, feeling oddly flustered. He gave a curt nod before walking past me, his long strides unfazed by the downpour. Within moments, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The door opened automatically, and before I could even fully process what had just happened, he was gone. I stared at the umbrella in my hand. "Weird guy," I mumbled, shaking my head as I finally stepped into the rain-protected space. Little did I know, this was just the beginning. I never expected to see him again. The umbrella had remained in my possession for a week, sitting neatly by my apartment door, a quiet reminder of that rainy night. I had considered returning it, but I had no way of finding him. A stranger in the rain, just a fleeting encounter, or so I thought. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. Tonight, I found myself standing in the middle of an opulent ballroom, surrounded by the city's elite. The crystal chandeliers above cast a warm glow over elegantly dressed guests, the sound of clinking glasses and soft jazz music filling the air. I tugged at the cuffs of my suit, feeling slightly out of place.
"Still uncomfortable at these things?"
My friend, Leo, nudged me playfully. He was the one who had dragged me here in the first place, insisting that networking at this gala would be good for my career. I sighed. "You know, I'd rather be at home."
"Come on, this isn't just any event. The director of H Group is here tonight."
I raised an eyebrow. H Group. The powerhouse company that dominated the luxury design and real estate market. Their influence stretched across industries, their name synonymous with prestige. The director, a man known for his cold, ruthless decision-making, was a figure shrouded in mystery. Not that it mattered to me. I was just a designer, far removed from the world of corporate giants. Leo's voice dropped to a whisper.
"Speak of the devil."
I followed his gaze, and my breath caught. Across the room, standing amidst a group of high-profile executives, was him. The man from that rainy night. My fingers instinctively tightened around my champagne glass. His presence was even more imposing under the grand lights of the ballroom. Dressed in a perfectly tailored black suit, his posture exuded effortless authority. His dark eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the crowd, taking in everything with an unreadable expression. I swallowed hard. This had to be a joke, right? "What's his name?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Leo smirked.
"Ethan Hayes, the youngest director in the history of H Group. Ruthless, brilliant, and completely untouchable."
He whistled.
Man, you do not want to get on his bad side.
Ethan Hayes. The name settled into my mind like a puzzle piece clicking into place. As if sensing my stare, Ethan's gaze shifted and landed directly on me. My breath hitched. For a second, I thought I saw a flicker of recognition in his eyes. Then, in a move that sent my heart racing, he excused himself from the conversation and started walking toward me.
Oh shit.
Leo muttered under his breath.
Why is he coming over?
I had the same question. The ballroom suddenly felt too small. The sound of conversation faded as Ethan closed the distance between us, his gaze locked onto mine with quiet intensity. When he finally stopped in front of me, I managed to find my voice. Mr. Hayes. I kept my tone polite, professional. Ethan tilted his head slightly, eyes narrowing as if assessing me.
You're the designer from Titan Studio, aren't you?
He knew where I worked. Yes, I answered carefully. His lips pressed into a thoughtful line. Then, in a low, even voice, he asked.
Do you always keep things that don't belong to you?
I froze. Wait. Was he talking about? My mind went blank for a second before realization struck. The umbrella. Holy. Before I could respond, Ethan's eyes flickered with something almost imperceptible, amusement, before he added.
Should I assume you intend to keep it permanently?
Heat crept up my neck. I was going to return it. He raised an eyebrow.
Is that so?
I didn't know how to find you.
That's no longer a problem.
His tone was smooth, but there was an underlying challenge in his words. I stared at him, heart pounding. This man, he was impossible to read. And yet, something about him made it impossible to look away. Ethan took a slow sip of his wine, then said,
Come to my office next Monday. I believe we have unfinished business.
I blinked. What?
Consider it an invitation.
His lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile, but it was close.
Or a challenge.
With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing in the middle of the gala, utterly speechless. Leo nudged me hard.
Dude. What just happened?
I had no answer. All I knew was, this was only the beginning. Monday arrived too quickly. I stood in front of the towering glass building of H Group, gripping the umbrella I had been meaning to return. Even though the morning sky was clear, I still felt like I was walking straight into a storm. This is a bad idea, I muttered to myself. But there was no backing out now. Ethan Hayes had summoned me, and I had no clue what he wanted. The whole weekend, I had replayed our brief conversation at the gala in my mind, trying to decipher his intentions. Was this really about the umbrella? Or was he just playing some sort of game? Taking a deep breath, I stepped inside. The H Group headquarters screamed luxury, high ceilings, polished marble floors, and an air of efficiency that made even standing in the lobby feel intimidating. I approached the front desk, and the receptionist, a sharply dressed woman, looked up.
Do you have an appointment?
She asked, giving me a once-over. I cleared my throat. I'm here to see Mr. Hayes. Her eyes widened slightly before quickly masking her surprise.
Your name.
I gave it to her, and she tapped a few keys before nodding.
Mr. Hayes is expecting you. Take the private elevator to the top floor.
I wasn't sure if I should be relieved or terrified. Ethan's office was exactly what I imagined, minimalist, vast, and intimidatingly sleek. Floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city skyline, and the entire space was decorated in cool, neutral tones. There was no excess, no warmth. It suited him perfectly. And there he was, standing near his desk, flipping through a document as if he hadn't just disrupted my entire weekend.
You're here.
Ethan said without looking up. I rolled my eyes. Was there ever an option not to be? He finally lifted his gaze, those sharp eyes assessing me with unreadable intent.
I see you brought the umbrella.
I exhaled, stepping forward to place it on his desk. Consider it officially returned. He studied it for a moment, then, without even acknowledging it, set his papers down and gestured toward the chair across from him.
Sit.
I hesitated. Am I in trouble or something?
Not yet.
He said smoothly.
That depends on how well you do today.
I frowned. Do what? Ethan leaned back in his chair, fingers interlocked.
H Group is in the middle of an exclusive interior design project. We need fresh ideas. Your studio was on the shortlist for collaboration, but after reviewing your past work, I have concerns.
My mouth parted slightly. Concerns?
Your designs are bold but inconsistent.
His tone was crisp, clinical.
Brilliant in concept, but sometimes lacking balance. You take too many risks without considering the final structure.
I bristled. I prefer innovation over playing it safe.
And I prefer results over reckless creativity.
He countered. Our eyes locked in a silent battle. I clenched my jaw. So what? You called me here just to criticize my work? Ethan leaned forward slightly.
No. I called you here to see if you're capable of proving me wrong.
For a moment, all I could do was stare. Then, I laughed, more out of disbelief than amusement. You want me to compete for this?
Unless you'd rather walk away.
His expression didn't change, but something about his tone was baiting. Damn him. Every instinct told me to refuse, to tell him that I didn't need his approval. But another part of me, the part that had worked tirelessly to make a name for myself in the industry, burned with the need to prove myself. I wasn't going to let Ethan Hayes dismiss me so easily. Fine, I said, lifting my chin. Give me a week. I'll present a concept that even you can't criticize. Ethan's lips curved slightly, just enough to hint at amusement.
We'll see about that.
I didn't know whether I had just accepted a challenge, or walked straight into a trap. I wasn't sure whether I hated Ethan Hayes or if I just hated how much space he was taking up in my mind. For the past few days, I had thrown myself into designing a concept for H Group's project, determined to prove him wrong. I barely slept, barely ate, just worked. And every time I hesitated, I'd hear his voice in my head, sharp and challenging.
We'll see about that.
Damn him. By the time I walked back into his office on Friday, I was running on caffeine and sheer stubbornness. Ethan was already at his desk, flipping through emails on his sleek black tablet, looking infuriatingly composed as usual.
You're on time.
He noted. Of course. I set my portfolio down, sliding it across his desk. Go ahead. Tear it apart. Ethan raised an eyebrow at my tone but wordlessly opened the folder. The room fell into silence as he examined my work, his eyes scanning each page with an intensity that made my pulse spike. I tried to read his expression, but the man was a fortress. No approval, no disapproval, just that calm, unreadable focus. The longer the silence stretched, the more my confidence wavered. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands over his lap.
This is better than I expected.
I blinked. Wait, was that a compliment? A hint of amusement flickered in his gaze.
Don't let it go to your head.
I rolled my eyes. Too late. Ethan exhaled, setting the portfolio aside.
Your design is innovative. Clean, but striking. You corrected the balance issue, and I see you took a more refined approach to the final structure.
So, does that mean I win?
Not yet.
I groaned. Seriously? What now? Ethan tapped his fingers lightly against the desk.
A design isn't just about creativity. It's about execution. I want you to oversee the next phase, work with my team to refine the details.
I hesitated. Wait, are you saying you want me to work directly, here? His lips curved ever so slightly.
Yes. Problem?
More like a warning. You're going to regret making me part of your team.
Let me be the judge of that.
Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. The next day, I wasn't prepared for just how demanding Ethan could be. From the moment I stepped into the H Group design department, I barely had time to breathe. Meetings, revisions, feedback, Ethan scrutinized everything with the precision of a man who refused to accept anything less than perfection.
This angle needs adjustment,
he said during one review, tapping a section of my blueprint. I frowned. The balance is already aligned.
It could be better.
It could also be fine the way it is, I shot back. Ethan leaned in slightly, lowering his voice.
Do you want to settle for fine?
I clenched my jaw. Damn him. Again. Still, despite our constant clashing, I couldn't ignore the underlying tension that came with every interaction. The way he would linger slightly behind me when reviewing my sketches. The way his gaze would settle on me a fraction too long before he spoke. The way his presence alone sent my heart into an erratic rhythm. And then, there were the moments that threw me completely off balance. Like today. I had been up late making last-minute changes, barely sleeping before dragging myself back to the office. By noon, exhaustion hit me like a truck. Ethan noticed.
You look terrible,
he said flatly as I rubbed my eyes. Thanks, I muttered. Great leadership skills, insulting your team. Instead of responding, he stood, walked over to the coffee machine in the corner of the office, and returned moments later, holding out a fresh cup. I stared at it. What?
Drink,
he ordered. I narrowed my eyes. Are you actually being nice to me right now? Ethan exhaled, setting the cup on the table.
Think of it as a professional necessity. You're no use to me if you pass out mid-project.
Wow. So heartwarming. He ignored my sarcasm, turning back to his desk as if nothing had happened. But as I picked up the cup, warmth spreading through my fingers, I couldn't shake the thought that, beneath his cold, calculating exterior, there was something else. Something deeper. And for the first time, I wanted to know what it was. I told myself it was nothing. The way Ethan handed me coffee. The way his gaze lingered. The way my pulse reacted every time he leaned just a little too close during our work sessions. It was nothing. But then, nothing shouldn't make my heart race like this. A week later. After nearly 2 weeks of working at H Group, I had somehow gotten used to Ethan's impossibly high standards, his ruthless critiques, and his annoyingly perfect three-piece suits. What I wasn't used to was the way the air seemed to shift between us when no one else was around. Like now. I was standing by the large conference table in Ethan's private office, going over the revised blueprints. He stood beside me, silent, his presence as intense as always. Here. I pointed at a section of the design. I adjusted the framework like you suggested. But I kept the original contrast. I think the color differentiation adds depth rather than clashing. Ethan hummed, a thoughtful sound deep in his throat. I turned my head slightly, and froze. I hadn't realized how close he had moved. Our shoulders nearly touched, and when I looked up, his gaze was already on me. Dark, unreadable. The air between us went still. For a second, neither of us spoke. Neither of us moved. Then, his gaze flickered downward, just briefly, before returning to mine. Was that? I swallowed. So? Ethan didn't immediately answer. Instead, he reached out, slowly tracing a finger along the page, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his skin just inches from mine.
I see your point,
he finally said, voice calm but lower. Smoother. I was hyper-aware of everything, his presence, his scent, the quiet control in his every movement. And then it happened. A simple accident. I reached for my tablet at the same moment Ethan moved his hand. Our fingers brushed. A small, fleeting touch. Nothing, really. But everything. A sharp jolt of awareness shot through me. My breath hitched. His fingers, warm, firm, lingered just a second too long before he pulled back, his expression unreadable. I snapped my gaze away, clearing my throat. Right. Good. We're good on the design then? Ethan's lips twitched, just the barest ghost of a smirk.
For now.
I grabbed my things faster than necessary, feeling the need to escape before my heart actually exploded. As I turned toward the door, I heard him speak again, calm, casual.
Are you always this jumpy?
I stiffened. Oh, this bastard. I turned back, forcing an easy smile. Only when my boss stares at me like he's analyzing a lab experiment. Ethan exhaled softly, a hum of amusement.
Interesting.
Not really. I huffed, gripping the doorknob. See you tomorrow, Mr. Hayes. His response came just as I stepped out.
I'll be looking forward to it.
I hated how warm those words made me feel. Over the next few days, I became painfully aware of every small interaction between us. The accidental brushes when we passed each other in the office. The way his fingers would linger just a little too long when he handed me documents. The occasional low hum of approval when he reviewed my work, so subtle, but enough to make my stomach flip. And worse, I started catching him watching me. It wasn't obvious. Not the kind of stare that demanded attention. No, Ethan Hayes was far too controlled for that. But I felt it. Like when I was focused on a sketch, only to glance up and find his gaze already on me, calm, thoughtful, something unreadable flickering beneath the surface. Like when I walked past him in the office, and his head would turn ever so slightly, his gaze following for just a second longer than necessary. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it. That it was just in my head. Until that night. It was late, way past working hours, but I had stayed behind to finish some final adjustments. The office was mostly empty, the usual hum of voices replaced by quiet solitude. I was stretching my sore muscles when the sound of a door opening caught my attention. I turned, and, of course, it was him. Ethan stood by the entrance of the room, jacket off, tie loosened slightly, just enough to make him look a little too effortlessly put together. His gaze flickered to my screen, then back to me.
You're still here.
He noted. You too, I shot back. He didn't deny it. Instead, he walked toward my desk, stopping just a foot away.
How's the progress?
Almost done. Just tweaking the last bit. He hummed, eyes scanning the design.
Good work.
I blinked. Did you just?
Don't make me repeat it.
I smirked. Wouldn't dream of it. I expected him to walk away, to return to his own office. But he didn't. Instead, he leaned down slightly, resting one hand on the desk beside me as he glanced at my screen. His proximity was distracting. Way too distracting. His voice was quiet when he spoke next.
You should rest. Overworking doesn't lead to good results.
I swallowed. You're one to talk. A ghost of a smirk crossed his lips.
Touché.
And then, for a brief, fleeting moment, he lingered. Not enough to be obvious. Not enough to be inappropriate. But enough to make my pulse hammer wildly against my ribs. Enough to make me wonder. Was I the only one feeling this? I was not supposed to be here. By here, I meant sitting at a dimly lit bar in the heart of downtown, nursing my third drink while my best friend, Liam, smirked at me from across the table.
All right, spill.
Liam said, swirling his whiskey.
You've been weird lately.
I groaned, rubbing my temples. I am not weird.
You're absolutely weird.
He leaned in, grinning.
I've known you for years. You get this specific look when something or someone is messing with your head.
I scowled. I don't have a look. Liam just raised an eyebrow, unconvinced.
So who is it?
No one, I lied.
Aha. Sure. So why are you drinking like a man with feelings?
I downed the rest of my drink before answering. Because my boss is a cold, insufferable perfectionist who makes my life miserable. Liam's eyes gleamed with amusement.
And yet, I don't hear hate in your voice. Just frustration.
I scoffed. Same thing.
Not even close.
He snorted.
Look stupidly good in a suit?
I winced. Shut up.
Oh, no way.
Liam practically gasped.
This is about Ethan Hayes?
I nearly choked on my drink. How do you know that?
Dude. He's all over the business news. Also, you've been practically vibrating with stress since you started working with him.
I groaned again, slumping against the table. It's not like that. Liam smirked.
Sure. Let's test that theory. Close your eyes.
I frowned. Why?
Just do it.
I sighed but obeyed.
Now, be honest. What's the first thing that comes to mind when you think of Ethan Hayes?
Silence stretched between us. My first thought? The way his gaze lingers when he thinks I don't notice. The rare moments when his voice softens, just slightly. The heat of his skin when our hands brush, those fleeting touches that shouldn't mean anything, but leave my heart racing. My throat went dry. Liam whistled.
Yeah. That's what I thought.
I snapped my eyes open. Shut up. He cackled.
Oh, you are so into him.
I shook my head aggressively. No. Nope. Not happening. He's my boss. He's impossible. He's... Liam interrupted, grinning.
Hot.
I groaned. I hate you. He just took a victorious sip of his drink.
Oh, this is going to be fun.
1 hour later, I was definitely drunk. Not falling over drunk, but just enough that my brain was running a little too loose. Which was how I found myself texting Ethan. Terrible idea. Disastrous idea. The worst possible idea. But apparently, drunk me was feeling bold. You know what your problem is?
It's late. Why are you texting me?
Because I had drinks and now I have thoughts.
That's concerning.
Your problem is that you act like you don't care about anything, but you totally do.
Go to sleep.
You pretend you're this untouchable, all-business CEO, but I've seen it. The way you pay attention. The way you notice the little things.
Are you drunk?
Maybe. But that doesn't make me wrong. There was a long pause. Too long. I squinted at my screen. Had he left me on red? Just as I was about to curse and throw my phone into the abyss, a new message appeared.
Where are you?
I hesitated. Downtown. Some bar. Another pause. Then.
Stay there.
I frowned. Why?
Because I'm coming to get you.
I thought I was hallucinating. Because 15 minutes later, Ethan actually walked into the bar. His usual suit jacket was gone, sleeves rolled up, tie loosened slightly. He looked different here. Out of place, like he didn't belong among the dim lights and buzz of conversation. And yet, somehow, he owned the room the moment he stepped inside. Liam noticed him first.
Dude? Your boss is here.
I groaned. I can see that. Ethan's gaze zeroed in on me instantly. His expression unreadable, but his movements purposeful as he strode toward us. Liam whistled under his breath.
Yeah, I see why you're in trouble.
Shut up, I muttered. Ethan stopped beside our table, arms crossing.
You're drunk.
I tilted my head. And you're bossy. His jaw twitched.
Come on. I'm taking you home.
Liam looked between us, amused.
This is highly entertaining, but I'll be heading out. Enjoy.
He winked before disappearing. Traitor. I turned back to Ethan. You didn't have to come.
You shouldn't be wandering around alone at this hour.
he said simply. I squinted at him. Are you worried about me? He held my gaze for a moment. Then, instead of answering, he sighed and reached down, his hand warm as he wrapped it around my wrist.
Come on,
He said, voice quieter now.
let's go.
His touch was firm, but not forceful. Steady. And for some reason, I let him lead me out of the bar, my heart pounding for reasons that had nothing to do with the alcohol. The car was silent. Ethan drove with one hand on the wheel, eyes fixed on the road. I watched him from the passenger seat, my mind fuzzy but focused on him. Why are you doing this? I finally asked. He exhaled through his nose.
Because I don't trust you to get home safely in this state.
I hummed. You care. His grip on the wheel tightened slightly.
Go to sleep.
I smirked, leaning my head back against the seat. You know what?
What?
I think you're not as cold as you pretend to be. Silence. Then, his voice, low, almost too quiet.
You're drunk.
I closed my eyes, feeling warmth spread through my chest. Maybe, I murmured. But I'm still right. I swore I heard the faintest chuckle. And in that moment, just before sleep took over, I thought, just maybe, Ethan Hayes wasn't as untouchable as he seemed. I woke up with a headache the size of my regrets. The sunlight filtering through my apartment windows felt unnecessarily aggressive, and my mouth was dry as hell. With a groan, I sat up, blinking against the blinding light. What even happened last night? And then, oh. Ethan. The bar. The car ride. The fact that my boss, my cold, unreadable, ridiculously attractive boss, had personally come to get me. I squeezed my eyes shut. Please tell me I didn't say anything embarrassing. The sound of movement made me freeze. Wait. I turned my head slowly, only to find Ethan Hayes, in my apartment, casually rolling up his sleeves as he stood by my kitchen counter. My brain short-circuited. What the hell? My voice came out hoarse. Ethan glanced over.
You're awake.
No. I'm hallucinating. He ignored that, holding up a cup of coffee.
Here. Drink this.
I stared at him, then at the coffee, then back at him. How did you even get in? Ethan gave me a flat look.
You let me in.
That sounded fake, but okay. I gingerly took the coffee, still suspicious. So, you just stayed?
You were half-conscious and mumbling nonsense. Someone had to make sure you didn't choke on your own regrets.
I groaned. Did I? Please tell me I didn't say anything weird. A pause. Ethan's lips almost twitched.
Define weird.
Oh, no. I buried my face in my hands. I hate everything.
You did say some interesting things.
He mused, sipping his own coffee.
Something about me pretending not to care. And that I totally do.
I wanted to die. Feel free to walk out that door and pretend this never happened, I muttered. He didn't move. Instead, he set his coffee down and leaned against the counter, watching me carefully. What? I frowned. Ethan tilted his head slightly.
Why does it bother you?
I blinked. What? He studied me, his usual cool expression unreadable.
The idea that I care. Why does it bother you?
My heart stuttered. It doesn't, I started, but Ethan just arched an eyebrow. I exhaled sharply, running a hand through my hair. Because it doesn't make sense, I admitted. You're you. The CEO. The guy who doesn't flinch at anything. And then suddenly, you're showing up at bars to pick me up? Staying to make sure I don't die. It's confusing. A brief flicker of something passed through Ethan's gaze, something almost like hesitation. Then, quietly, he said.
You think I don't flinch at anything?
I frowned. His tone was different. Almost too controlled. Do you? I asked. For a moment, Ethan didn't answer. Then, finally.
I wasn't always like this.
My breath caught. Ethan Hayes, the man who never shared anything personal, was about to say something real. I didn't push him. I just waited, letting the silence stretch until he spoke again.
I grew up in a household where failure wasn't an option.
He said, his voice steady but distant.
Everything had to be perfect. Every move, every decision, there was no room for mistakes.
I listened, quietly.
My father ran H Group before me. He built it from the ground up. To him, the company was everything. And so was control.
Ethan exhaled.
I learned early on that emotions, attachments, were liabilities. You want to succeed? You keep yourself in check. You don't waver.
His words settled heavily between us. I wasn't sure what to say. I had always seen Ethan as this impossibly put-together, untouchable force. But now, I was starting to see the cracks beneath the surface. And somehow, that made him feel more real. Is that why you act the way you do? I asked. Ethan's gaze met mine, sharp but unreadable.
It's why I don't flinch.
Something about that answer made my chest tighten. Because the way he said it, like it wasn't a choice, but something ingrained into him, felt lonely. I set my coffee down and shifted slightly. You know, you don't have to be that person all the time. Ethan's expression flickered.
What?
You don't have to carry everything alone. I hesitated, then added, you don't have to prove anything, Ethan. The moment stretched between us. His name, his actual name, felt unfamiliar on my tongue. But I liked the way it sounded. And I didn't miss the way his gaze darkened slightly when I said it. For the first time since I met him, Ethan looked, caught off guard. He didn't respond right away. But the look in his eyes, like he was considering something, made my pulse quicken. Then, after a long pause.
You're different from most people I've worked with,
he said quietly. I raised an eyebrow. That sounds like a compliment. He exhaled, shaking his head slightly.
Don't get used to it.
I smirked. Too late. For the first time that morning, something shifted in the air between us. It wasn't anything big, just a moment. A glimpse of something neither of us wanted to admit yet. But it was there. And somehow, I had a feeling it was only the beginning. The rest of the day passed in a blur. After Ethan left my apartment that morning, his expression still unreadable, his words still lingering in my mind, I found myself distracted. At work, I kept stealing glances at him during meetings, watching the way his sharp gaze flicked over reports, the way he spoke with absolute precision. To everyone else, he was the same imposing CEO, the one who commanded every room he walked into. But I knew better now. I had seen something behind that carefully constructed facade. And the worst part? I wanted to see more. It was nearly midnight when I found myself alone in the office, rubbing my temples as I stared at my computer screen.
Still here?
I jumped slightly at the deep voice, turning to see Ethan standing by the doorway. He looked tired. His usual pristine suit jacket was gone, his sleeves rolled up again, something I was starting to realize he only did when he was more relaxed. I could ask you the same thing, I replied. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him.
I had some things to wrap up.
I sighed, leaning back in my chair. Let me guess, business never sleeps. His lips almost curved.
Something like that.
Ethan leaned against the desk beside mine, arms crossed. There was something different about the way he was looking at me tonight. Not his usual calculating gaze. Something softer. Something that made my breath hitch.
You're distracted.
He finally said. I swallowed. What?
At work today.
He elaborated.
You were distracted.
I stared at him. You noticed? His gaze didn't waver.
I notice everything.
My pulse spiked. Of course he did. This was Ethan Hayes. The man who ran a multi-billion-dollar company like it was second nature. The man who never let his emotions dictate his actions. And yet, the way he was looking at me right now felt anything but detached. I licked my lips, suddenly aware of how quiet the office was. I just had a lot on my mind. Ethan tilted his head slightly.
Because of what I said this morning?
I hesitated. Then, finally, I nodded. His expression didn't change, but I saw the slight shift in his posture. The careful way he processed my answer before speaking again.
Do you regret it?
He asked. My heart pounded. Regret what?
Knowing.
I sucked in a breath. No. I didn't regret it. If anything, I regretted how much I wanted to know more. I exhaled shakily, running a hand through my hair. Ethan, why did you tell me all that? A pause. Then.
I don't know.
Honest. Simple. But somehow, that answer made my chest tighten even more. I looked down at my hands. You said you don't flinch, I murmured. He didn't respond. I forced myself to lift my gaze. But what if you're wrong? Ethan's eyes locked onto mine. For a split second, something broke in his expression, like a carefully guarded wall cracking, just enough for me to see through. You said emotions are a liability, I continued, voice barely above a whisper. That attachments are distractions. But you came to get me that night. You stayed. I leaned forward slightly. You flinched, Ethan. Silence. A thick, unbearable silence. Ethan's jaw clenched. His fingers curled slightly against the desk. Then, before I could say anything else, he moved. In an instant, he was standing in front of me, so close that I could feel the heat radiating off him. His voice was low.
You think I don't notice how you affect me?
My breath hitched. His fingers brushed against mine, light, hesitant, but undeniably there.
You think I haven't tried to ignore it?
His gaze darkened.
Tried to ignore you.
My entire body felt like it was on fire. Ethan.
I told myself it didn't matter.
His voice was quieter now, almost like he was speaking more to himself than to me.
That I could push it away. That I could control it.
His fingers curled around my wrist.
But I can't.
My heart was beating so loudly I was sure he could hear it. He was close enough now that I could see the tension in his jaw, the conflict in his eyes. And yet, he wasn't pulling away. Neither was I. I swallowed hard. Then stopped trying. A sharp inhale. And then, his grip tightened, and just like that, the space between us disappeared. His lips crushed against mine, firm, desperate, like he had been holding back for far too long. I gasped into the kiss, my fingers instinctively clutching the front of his shirt. Ethan's other hand came up, cupping the back of my neck as he deepened the kiss, his usual control slipping away piece by piece. For a moment, nothing else mattered. Not the company. Not the complications. Just this. Just us. When we finally broke apart, we were both breathing hard. Ethan rested his forehead against mine, his voice rough.
This is dangerous.
I let out a shaky laugh. I know. His fingers brushed against my skin, hesitant but warm. I smiled slightly. But you're still not pulling away. Ethan exhaled. Then, quietly, almost like he was admitting it to himself.
No. I'm not.
And that was all I needed to hear. Keeping a secret relationship is way harder than I thought. Especially when your not-so-secret partner happens to be Ethan Hayes, CEO, perfectionist, and apparently, a man who has zero regard for my sanity. Because while I was out here desperately trying to keep things professional, Ethan was making it very difficult. And by difficult, I mean, I was in the middle of a department meeting, taking notes and trying to focus, when I felt it. A gaze. His gaze. I swallowed, resisting the urge to look up. Nope. I'm imagining it. But then.
Is something wrong?
I nearly jumped at the deep voice right beside me. I turned, only to see Ethan standing way too close, his hand resting on the table as he leaned in slightly. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes, oh, his eyes, held something dangerous. No, I said quickly, my voice way too high-pitched. His gaze flickered downward, right to my neck, where I knew a faint red mark still lingered from last night. Heat rushed to my face. Ethan smirked. Oh, that's smug.
Well, if you're feeling unwell,
he said smoothly, straightening up.
Let me know.
And then, as if nothing had happened, he turned back to the meeting, completely composed. Meanwhile, I was dying inside. The problem wasn't just at work. It was everywhere. A stolen touch when no one was looking. A lingering glance across the room. A brush of fingers as he handed me a document, his thumb pressing just slightly against my skin before letting go. I was losing my mind. You're doing this on purpose, I hissed one evening when we were alone in his office. Ethan arched an eyebrow.
Doing what?
I narrowed my eyes. Messing with me. His lips twitched, not quite a smirk, but definitely amused.
I don't know what you mean.
He said smoothly, taking a sip of his coffee. I wanted to strangle him. Or kiss him. Both seemed like valid options. The worst moment, however, happened on a Friday evening. Most employees had already left, and I was finishing up some designs at my desk when my phone buzzed.
My office. Now.
I frowned. Demanding much? Still, I grabbed my things and headed upstairs. The moment I stepped inside his office, I barely had time to react before Ethan grabbed my wrist and pulled me in. The door clicked shut behind me. Ethan, what? Before I could finish, his lips were on mine, hot and insistent, stealing the breath from my lungs. I barely had time to process before I was pinned against the desk, his hands firm but careful as they trapped me in place. I gasped against his mouth, my fingers gripping his shirt. We're at work, I managed between kisses.
I know.
He murmured, his lips grazing dangerously close to my ear. I shivered. His hand skimmed down my waist, just as the sound of footsteps echoed outside. My heart stopped. Ethan stilled.
Sir.
A voice, his assistant, rang from the other side of the door. I nearly choked. Ethan, of course, was perfectly calm.
Yes?
He called out, his voice flawlessly composed, like he wasn't literally pressing me against his desk just seconds ago.
There's a file that needs your approval before the weekend.
The assistant continued.
Should I bring it in?
I panicked. Ethan's grip tightened ever so slightly on my waist, as if silently telling me to stay still. And then, with no remorse whatsoever, he leaned in and brushed his lips against my jaw. I swore internally. The man was evil.
Leave it outside.
Ethan said smoothly.
I'll take care of it later.
Understood, sir.
A moment later, the footsteps faded. Only then did I exhale, glaring at him. That was not funny. Ethan, completely unfazed, simply smirked.
It was a little funny.
I smacked his chest. His chuckle was entirely too pleased. Keeping things hidden was getting harder. Not just because of Ethan's shameless teasing, but because, I was starting to realize, I didn't want to hide. The way he looked at me when no one else was watching. The way he softened when it was just the two of us. This wasn't just some workplace fling. And that scared me. Because if it wasn't just a secret, then what was it? Keeping a secret relationship was one thing. Falling in love with Ethan Hayes was another. I had spent weeks convincing myself that this was just an intense attraction, a dangerous thrill, a game of stolen glances and hidden touches. But then, somewhere between his teasing smirks and the rare, fleeting moments of softness, I realized I was in too deep. And the worst part? I wasn't sure where Ethan stood. Was I just a distraction to him? A momentary indulgence before he returned to his perfectly structured, emotionally untouchable world? Or did he feel it too? It started with a meeting. A high-stakes client. A multi-million-dollar project. I sat at the long conference table, my designs displayed on the massive screen. Ethan was seated at the head, exuding his usual aura of effortless authority. Everything was going smoothly, until the client's daughter walked in. Tall. Elegant. Gorgeous. And she walked straight to Ethan with a knowing smile.
Ethan.
She purred, resting a hand on his arm.
It's been too long.
I froze. Ethan barely reacted, offering a polite nod.
It has.
The client chuckled.
My daughter just returned from overseas. She's been looking forward to catching up with you.
The unspoken matchmaking in that statement made my stomach twist.
Maybe we should all have dinner after this.
The daughter suggested.
Just like old times.
Ethan's jaw tightened. It was a subtle thing, so small that most people wouldn't even notice. But I noticed. Because I knew him now.
We'll see.
Ethan replied smoothly, his voice carefully neutral. I should have left it at that. I should have ignored the tightness in my chest and the irrational jealousy clawing at my gut. But then. She laughed, lightly brushing her fingers against his sleeve.
You're always so hard to pin down, aren't you?
And before I could stop myself, before I could think, I stood up. I need some air. The room went silent. Ethan's gaze snapped to me instantly. I didn't wait for a reaction. I grabbed my notebook and walked out, ignoring the way my hands were shaking. I barely made it to the empty hallway before I heard footsteps behind me. And then.
Explain.
I turned, heart hammering, to see Ethan standing there, arms crossed, eyes unreadable. Explain what? I shot back, trying to keep my voice steady. Ethan took a step closer.
What just happened in there?
I let out a bitter laugh. What do you mean? That wasn't anything unusual, was it? Just another potential business merger.
Stop.
His voice was low. A warning. I looked away. You didn't seem to mind. Ethan exhaled sharply, running a hand through his hair.
I don't care about her.
Oh? Could have fooled me. He was in front of me in an instant.
What exactly are you trying to say?
I clenched my jaw. I don't want to be some hidden secret, Ethan. His breath hitched. I swallowed, forcing myself to continue. I don't want to be someone you only acknowledge when no one else is looking. Ethan's eyes darkened.
You think that's what this is?
I laughed, but it was hollow. Isn't it? His fingers curled into fists. And then.
I want you.
He said, voice low, rough, and completely raw. I froze. He took a step closer.
Do you think I do this with just anyone?
I opened my mouth, but no words came out.
I've built my entire life around control.
He murmured.
Discipline. Strategy. But you.
His jaw clenched.
You make me lose control.
I swallowed hard. Then prove it. Ethan's eyes locked onto mine. A charged silence stretched between us, heavy, intense, impossible to ignore. Then, before I could react, his hands cupped my face, and his lips crashed against mine. This wasn't like the other kisses. It wasn't teasing, or stolen, or secretive. It was possessive. Desperate. Like he was trying to tell me everything he couldn't put into words. I melted into him, my hands clutching his shirt as I kissed him back with everything I had. By the time we broke apart, we were both breathless. Ethan rested his forehead against mine.
You're not a secret.
My chest ached. Then stopped treating me like one. A long pause. Then, finally,
I will.
2 days later, it happened. We were at a corporate event, one of those extravagant galas Ethan always attended with a mask of polite indifference. Except this time. He didn't stand alone. He didn't keep his distance. Instead, in front of hundreds of people, he placed a hand on my lower back, guiding me through the crowd like it was the most natural thing in the world. When reporters took photos, he didn't move away. When colleagues gave knowing glances, he didn't care. And when someone had the audacity to ask,
Mr. Hayes, who's this?
Ethan simply looked at me, his expression softening for just a second, before turning back to them.
Someone important.
I swallowed hard. That was it. No grand speeches. No elaborate declarations. Just those 2 words, enough to shake my entire world. And in that moment, I knew. Ethan Hayes had finally chosen. Falling in love with Ethan Hayes was never part of my plan. But then again, nothing about him was predictable. And now, as I stood beside him at yet another high-profile event, feeling the weight of his hand resting on my lower back, not hiding, not pretending, not sneaking around anymore, I realized something. I wasn't just falling anymore. I had fallen completely. The moment Ethan casually told the press that I was someone important, my phone exploded with messages. My coworkers. My friends. Even my boss, who, ironically, already knew but enjoyed the drama. And the internet? Oh, they had a field day. Hashtag Ethan Hayes dating started trending within hours. Speculation ran wild. Some people thought I was his long-lost childhood love. Others assumed I was some mysterious heir to a hidden fortune. In reality, I was just me. And for some reason, that was enough for him. Being in a public relationship with Ethan Hayes came with adjustments. For one, I no longer had to pretend at work. No more secretly stealing glances across the office. No more sneaking into his office just to get a moment alone. Now, Ethan openly sent me messages during meetings, completely shamelessly.
Stop biting your lip. It's distracting.
Stop staring.
Impossible.
Or, even worse.
Dinner at my place tonight.
I have plans.
Cancel them.
Excuse me.
You're excused. See you at 8.
The nerve of this man. But the worst part? I always showed up at 8. It wasn't all smooth sailing, though. Because while Ethan had accepted us, without hesitation, I still had my doubts. One night, as I lay in his bed, wrapped in his warmth, I let my insecurities slip out. This doesn't scare you? I murmured. Ethan shifted beside me, his fingers tracing slow, lazy patterns along my spine.
What doesn't?
This. I swallowed. Us. His hand stilled.
Why would it?
I hesitated. Because I don't fit into your world. Silence stretched between us. Then, slowly, Ethan sat up, pulling me with him. His expression was unreadable, but his grip on my wrist was firm.
You are my world,
he said simply. I stopped breathing. Ethan exhaled, running a hand through his hair.
Do you know how many people I trust?
I shook my head.
1.
He said, holding my gaze.
You.
My throat tightened.
I built my life around control.
He continued, voice low.
I don't let people in. I don't let people matter.
His fingers brushed my cheek.
But then you happened.
I swallowed hard. Ethan. He cupped my face.
And now, I can't imagine my life without you in it.
My chest ached. And just like that, every doubt, every fear, every insecurity faded into nothing. Because Ethan Hayes didn't just say things. He meant them. A year later, we stood on a balcony overlooking the city, glasses of wine in hand, the warm evening breeze curling around us.
So,
Ethan murmured, watching me carefully.
Where do you see yourself in 5 years?
I thought about it for a moment. Then, with a teasing smile, I said, still dealing with your impossible ass, probably. Ethan smirked.
That's a given.
I chuckled. But honestly, I turned to face him fully. Right here. His smirk faltered, just for a second. And then, softness. The kind of softness that Ethan only ever showed me. He reached out, brushing his knuckles against my jaw.
Good.
I leaned into his touch, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat against my skin. No matter how much the world changed. No matter how much time passed. We would always find our way back to each other.